Hello, this is the presentation I gave at the Celebrating the Impact of Regional Research and Education conference held in Devonport on November 11th, 2022. I wanted to record a version of this talk to share with West Coast residents so people have some idea of my preliminary findings and can give me feedback. As some of you know, my name is Megan Hinsman and I'm a PhD candidate in the School of Geography, Planning, and Spatial Sciences at the University of Tasmania. My PhD is focused on community well-being on the West Coast of Tasmania, and for this presentation I am examining the strategies West Coast residents have developed to enable their lives in a remote, regional, and rural area. I have termed these strategies as making do to emphasize the effort residents put into these strategies and ultimately the sense of accepting less than what they believe is needed for their communities to survive. This is my first time presenting my preliminary findings, so I'm very interested in people's feedback. And just to be clear, what I'm presenting on in this talk is just one chapter of my thesis, and so there'll be much more in depth in the actual thesis itself. Thank you. The West Coast of Tasmania is an aptly named local government area on the West Coast of Tasmania. I lived in Queenstown on the West Coast for 8 months in 2021 for my research and traveled across the West Coast and interviewed 42 people, 21 women and 21 men, in addition to my ethnographic work and participant observation. Since I moved away, I try to return to the West Coast every 1 to 2 months to keep in touch with residents. The region's population was 4,263 in the 2021 census. The median age of the region is 47 compared to 42 in Tasmania and 38 in the rest of Australia. The reason I point this out here is the narrative of an aging population on the West Coast, with young people and families moving away, typically for access to more opportunities. It is a step to extrapolate so much from the high median age, but it is noteworthy. From the census, the main industries of employment are mining, accommodation, grocery stores, and local government. Mining has been the predominant industry of the region historically and is an important part of regional identity. The other important resource extractive industries, with less of a long-term employment and community impact, are logging, fishing and fish farming, and hydroelectricity generation. More recently, the West Coast Council, Tourism Tasmania, and other local organizations have begun to develop tourism in the region, particularly through promoting the natural beauty and wilderness of the area, mountain biking, industrial heritage, and the arts. I am framing this story and presentation through challenges on the West Coast and community responses to these challenges. I do not want to present life on the West Coast as one filled with adversity and feed into a deficit discourse. I want to be very clear that I'm very impressed by the strengths and approaches of many West Coast residents. This is a complex story. In an attempt to focus on the coping strategies of West Coast residents, I will provide a brief summary of the changes and challenges West Coast residents are experiencing. The changes in West Coast communities are related to changes in the mining industry, an increase in drive-in and drive-out work schedules, impacts of globalization, technological advancements, and the decline of requisite manpower. Changes in the mining industry have resulted in fewer West Coast mining jobs and a decline in population numbers, which has further impacted access to goods and services. The uncertainty of mining and mines on the West Coast has made residents feel more vulnerable because for previous generations, mining was consistent, steady work. Additionally, mining is linked to regional identity, heritage, security, and manliness. The uncertainty of mining has impacted community psyche in many ways. Population decline. As stated, the narrative goes that as mines closed or restructured, miners and their families moved away. And because of the decrease in population, stores and businesses on the West Coast started to close and services decreased. This has led to more people moving away and a steady decline that many residents are concerned about and trying to address. The West Coast is wet, rainy, and cold. The weather can result in social isolation and mental health issues, and due to the poorly insulated or constructed housing stock, the weather can impact physical health. Personally, I was ill frequently when I lived on the West Coast. As mentioned, the houses on the West Coast are typically old, with limited insulation, and have issues with damp, and in some cases were intended as temporary accommodation, such as the hydroelectric houses in Teller, or the prefabricated and trucked-in mining homes in Queenstown, Zeehan, and Rosebery. Local residents are increasingly struggling to access housing because in 2020, mainlanders began to purchase houses and outprice local residents and turn these houses into Airbnbs due to tourism speculation. Many of the challenges on the West Coast are issues of access. Access to healthcare, access to education, access to employment, access to extracurricular activities, and access to goods and services. It's just a lot of work when you live on the West Coast. My friend Sue said this to me when she was explaining how her mother bought a second-hand electric wheelchair with issues, and the battery might be bad, but there's nowhere to test the battery on the West Coast, and they do not want to order the $200 battery in case that is not what is actually wrong with it. They will have to take the wheelchair 3 hours up the coast to Burnie to get it tested and then order the needed parts. So in the meantime, her mother has to deal with a lackluster wheelchair. This is an example of how issues of access make life much more challenging and complicated for West Coast residents. What could likely be dealt with in a day in a city will take Sue and her family weeks to deal with. During my time on the West Coast, I came to realize that many behaviors of West Coast residents are actually coping strategies, some of which have been developed over generations, which enables residents to continue to live on the West Coast. I broke these strategies down into two main categories: adaptation or acceptance. Adaptation is the more active response, where residents make decisions or take actions to facilitate their lives on the West Coast. Acceptance is the passive strategy, where residents accept changes or what is available to them. Acceptance can be positive, termed as acquiescence, or negative, termed as apathy. Whether acceptance is actually a choice will be explored in my thesis. To be clear, both the coping strategies of adaptation or acceptance are always in flux, depending on the individual and their mental, emotional, economic, and social capacity. Three examples of adaptive strategies I observe on the West Coast are support networks, West Coast identity, and making your own fun. Strong social and familial networks are an important factor to thriving in any community, but on the West Coast, these networks act as a form of security and have a material aspect, which facilitates well-being. Friends, neighbors, and family members will assist each other with food, transport, employment opportunities, childcare, mental health support, housing, and socializing and entertainment. Social networks are a common motivator and a support tool for remaining in West Coast communities. The West Coast identity, or the culturally accepted factors of what makes someone a West Coaster, are based in strategies of survival in a remote region. West Coast residents speak about the region as a frontier that is rough and tough, and identify themselves as rough, tough, independent, and self-sufficient. West Coast identity acts as a regional adaptation in three ways. Firstly, the belief that there are reasons to be proud of living on the West Coast enables locals to be motivated to overcome challenges that are inherent in living in the region. Secondly, locals are well versed in local history and are aware that living in the region has always been challenging, and by being able to endure and overcome, modern residents are part of the legacy of the West Coast. Thirdly, it is understood by local residents that to be a West Coaster is to accept and overcome these challenges. Part of life on the West Coast is, as Queenstown resident Chantel puts it, the ability to make your own fun. Youth and adults find it necessary to create opportunities for fulfilling socializing. In the past, sports were a focal point of the social lives of community members, but as the sporting clubs and teams have closed, these opportunities have decreased, and gaps have developed in extracurricular activities. Due to the decline in sport, locals increasingly expect themselves and others to create entertainment opportunities. Some examples of these are crafting groups, local choirs, book clubs, mountain biking clubs, and walking groups. An issue with making your own fun is that much of the socialization is based around alcohol. Drinking is a part of sporting culture, and most of the main indoor socializing spaces are in pubs. If a person does not drink or is avoiding alcohol, this can lead to them becoming socially isolated. 4 interview participants linked solitary living and limited socializing with the fact they do not drink. The photo I have included here is that of the Queenstown tip. West Coast residents were upset when the West Coast Council changed the rules around the tip and no longer allowed residents to leave or collect reusable materials. In a region where access is challenging, one woman referred to it as a handy hardware store. The term scavenging caught my attention. People weren't scavenging, they were reusing, recycling, and making do. Government support as a coping strategy comes in multiple forms and can be viewed as positive or negative, but we are not here to judge these strategies, merely to observe and attempt to understand the role of government support in the West Coast. Anecdotally and through observations and interviews, there appears to be a significant number of people who are on Centrelink or receive some kind of government support on the West Coast. It appears people receive Centrelink either through disability, lack of employment, or due to providing care for friends or family. When it comes to community-wide funding, West Coast towns expect a certain level of support from the state and federal governments due to the significant amount of wealth that has been generated in the region. When residents feel their region is being overlooked or underfunded, they can feel that they and their region have been exploited. The expectations of the local government of the West Coast Council is high and comes from a legacy of being mining towns with widespread company support, fulfilling the role that the West Coast Council is now expected to take over. Weather, as previously mentioned, the weather on the West Coast is wet and cold. This has resulted in a get-on-with-it attitude, with residents doing things despite of the weather because otherwise they would spend their lives indoors. Healthcare was the most problematic acceptance strategy I observed. If the medical care needed is not on the West Coast, or the process to access the needed care, such as mental health support, was too challenging, some people would simply struggle along as is. This can lead to more serious health conditions down the track and negatively impacts people's quality of life. Even some residents who are more engaged will ignore significant health symptoms until their next trip up the coast. One of the key strategies I've observed on the West Coast is that of travel. Some West Coast residents think of nothing of driving the 7 to 8 hours to Hobart and back in a day. Others never leave their hometown. A person's ability and willingness to travel directly impacts their quality of life and what is available to them. Older people, people who are on low incomes or unemployed, people without vehicles, or people with disabilities find access the most challenging. Community Transport Tasmania and the bus system are alternatives for transport, but rely on a person's capacity to navigate a system. There is a strong drinking culture and tradition of drinking on the West Coast. However, where people drink appears to have changed as people have moved away from pubs and appear to primarily drink in private homes. This can lead to further isolation. Some people attribute drinking to culture and others attribute it to boredom. I apologize for the block of words, but Anna's quote hits on so many points about the challenges of living on the West Coast, regional identity, issues of access, and the ultimate solution of people moving away. Anna explains, it's only healthy people who can afford to stay. Once you start needing domiciliary services or welfare services of any sort, that's when people make a big decision to move from the area. But as long as you're healthy and you're prepared to live with certain restrictions or handicaps in your life, you make the best with what you've got. There are very stoic people living on the West Coast. They've had to put up with a lot of shit and a lot of decisions that don't necessarily favor what they believe their lifestyle should be. But they do generally try and make the best with what they've got. And there are a lot of people who are quite happy with that. But once they start needing wheelchair access, or if they've got handicapped children that need support services, or you have autistic kids that need attention, they're not going to stay. They can't afford to stay. You want what's best for your family or whoever is dependent on you. You'll make the decision to be where you need to be to get those services. When examining the strategies of West Coast residents, I began to realize how important the power of choice is. When residents are making more active decisions, agency, they appear to be more satisfied and happier in general. But it is important to note that it is people who have capacity who are able to more actively respond to challenges, so this observation could be a self-fulfilling prophecy. Residents feel empowered by choosing to live on the West Coast, but also feel disempowered by the limitations of the region. When discussing health care, Tuller resident Jenny described it as an absence of choice. So really in regards to mental health, poverty is not being able to choose. We're very impoverished with our health. The poverty of choice Jenny described extends beyond healthcare to many of the challenges of living on the West Coast. Ultimately, the question is how successful are these strategies? Are West Coast residents thriving or surviving? To which I will answer yes to both and neither. West Coast residents do all this hard work and make all these sacrifices because they love the West Coast and their communities, and they want to continue on the West Coast and be members of the communities. However, they do know their lives would be easier elsewhere, and they do believe their lives should be easier on the West Coast. I believe that improving life on the West Coast is an issue of improving access. Thank you.